Have you ever heard a story so intense it felt like a movie? Studies show people remember stories 22 times more than facts. And today, you're about to hear one of the most shocking and emotional stories yet. A heroic act, a shocking mystery, and an ending no one saw coming. But did the truth come out in time? Comment where you're watching from and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Let's get started. Seattle's cool evening air carried the crisp scent of damp earth and pine. The towering evergreens lining the edges of Lake Washington Park rustled softly in the autumn breeze, their golden leaves swirling onto the worn dirt paths. It was the kind of peaceful setting that most people would find relaxing. But for Michael Carter, it was just another night of trying to clear his mind. Michael, 34 years old, was a Seattle firefighter, his body still aching from an exhausting 48-hour shift. The latest fire had been a bad one. An apartment complex engulfed in flames, a desperate mother screaming for her child, and the smell of burning furniture still clinging to his skin. He had saved lives that night, but the ones he couldn't save haunted him. He ran a hand through his short brown hair, sighing as he adjusted his navy blue Seattle Fire Department hoodie. His tall, broad-shouldered frame moved with exhaustion, his boots scuffing against the gravel path. He had come to the park for some air, some silence. But silence was the last thing he got. Somewhere in the distance, a sharp, desperate bark echoed through the trees. Michael stopped mid-step, his instincts kicking in. He turned toward the noise, his firefighter training always putting him on high alert. At first, he didn't see anything, but then, through the dimming light, a dog emerged from the bushes. It was a thin, golden retriever mix, her ribs faintly visible beneath her scruffy coat. Her fur was matted, her ears low, and her eyes, dark and desperate, locked onto his. Behind her, a tiny, trembling puppy struggled to keep up, its small paws stumbling over the uneven ground. Michael felt something stir in his chest. A stray? Abandoned? Lost? The mother dog hesitated for only a second before making a beeline straight for him. "Whoa, girl," Michael murmured, instinctively lowering himself into a crouch. "Where did you come from?" The dog didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, her muddy paws pressing against his jeans as she let out a sharp whine. Michael's pulse quickened. This wasn't a dog begging for food. This was something else. She gripped the hem of his pant leg between her teeth, pulling hard. Hey. He gently pulled back, but she didn't let go. She barked, low and urgent, her tail wagging but her eyes filled with fear. Michael's brows furrowed. He glanced at the tiny, exhausted puppy behind her, its fragile frame trembling as it sat in the dirt, looking up at him with big, round eyes. His chest tightened. Whatever was happening, this wasn't normal. He looked around the empty park, the sound of distant traffic humming from the nearby highway. There were no other people in sight. Just the trees, the winding paths, and this desperate dog trying to tell him something. Michael exhaled sharply. "All right, girl," he muttered, standing up and dusting off his jeans. "Show me." As if understanding his words, the golden retriever immediately turned and took off down the trail, her tail wagging frantically. The puppy, though weak, scrambled to follow. Michael's boots crunched against the dirt as he followed them, his firefighter instincts now fully alert. Whatever was at the end of this trail, he had a feeling it wasn't good. Michael's heartbeat quickened as he followed the golden retriever deeper into the wooded park. The sun had almost completely set now, leaving only the dim glow of the streetlights flickering through the trees. The dog moved with urgency, her paws kicking up damp leaves, her head glancing back every few steps to make sure Michael was still following. The tiny puppy struggled to keep up, its small legs wobbly, but it never stopped moving. Something about this didn't feel like a stray just leading him to food. This was different. This was a cry for help. Michael pulled his phone from his pocket, turning on the flashlight as the trail narrowed into a less traveled path. The deeper they went, the more the noise of the city faded away, replaced by the rustling of trees and the occasional hoot of an owl overhead. The retriever suddenly let out a sharp bark and darted to the right. Michael slowed down. "All right, girl, what is it?" The beam of his flashlight illuminated the area ahead, and that's when he saw it. An old, overgrown path. It was barely visible beneath the thick brush, the ground uneven with broken branches and tangled roots. It was clear that no one had walked this way in a long time. Michael hesitated. He wasn't one to be easily rattled, but something about this felt off. The retriever, however, had no doubts. She rushed forward, barking louder now, her voice echoing through the trees. Michael tightened his grip on the flashlight and followed. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to change, the crisp, fresh scent of pine and damp earth fading into something else. Something stale. Then he saw it. A small wooden cabin, tucked between the trees. The place was a wreck. The roof sagged, the windows were covered in grime, and the front steps were warped from years of rain. A rusted-out pickup truck sat to the side, its tires half buried in the dirt. Michael's stomach twisted. "Is this it?" he muttered to himself. The retriever whined and ran ahead, stopping just short of the porch. She paced nervously, her eyes fixed on something near the door. Michael followed her gaze. Lying in the dirt, just at the edge of the porch, was a small, battered backpack. His flashlight beam landed on it, and he immediately noticed the tiny handprints smudged into the fabric. His breath caught. A child's backpack. His fingers clenched as he bent down, flipping it open. Inside, among crumpled pieces of paper and a half-empty juice box, something caught his eye. A note, scribbled in messy, childlike handwriting. Michael carefully unfolded the damp paper and brought it closer to his flashlight. The words, though uneven and shaky, made his chest tighten. "Help US. We're still here. Please." A cold chill ran down his spine. Still here. Someone was inside that cabin. Michael's pulse pounded in his ears as he shot a glance toward the retriever, who was now scratching at the door. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his phone, his fingers flying over the screen as he called 911. "This is Michael Carter," he said, his voice low but urgent. "I'm at Lake Washington Park, near the old hiking trail. There's an abandoned cabin, and I just found a note saying someone is still inside. Sir, is there any sign of forced entry or danger?" the dispatcher asked. Michael's jaw clenched. "I don't know yet, but I'm about to find out." He didn't wait for permission. He stuffed the note into his pocket and stepped onto the creaking porch. The retriever barked louder now, as if begging him to hurry. Michael reached for the door handle, and it turned. Unlocked. His gut told him that whatever was inside, he wasn't ready for it. But that didn't matter. Taking a deep breath, Michael pushed the door open. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness and silence. Michael took a cautious step inside, his flashlight cutting through the heavy air, illuminating dust swirling in the dim space. The air smelled stale, a mix of mildew and something fainter but unmistakable, rotting wood and neglect. The golden retriever pushed past him, her nose to the ground, sniffing furiously as she moved deeper into the cabin. The small puppy hesitated by the door, whimpering softly. Michael's senses were on high alert. His eyes darted across the crumbling walls, the floorboards covered in scattered papers and broken glass. Against the far wall sat an old couch with ripped fabric, and in the corner, a table stacked with empty food cans and plastic bottles. Someone had been living here, but not in any way that was safe. Then he heard it, a soft rustling. He froze, his flashlight sweeping across the room. The sound came from behind a wooden divider, where a doorway led into what looked like a back room. Michael took a careful step forward. His pulse pounded. "Hello," he called out, his voice steady but gentle. "Is someone here?" Silence. Then, a shuffle. A quick, sudden movement. Michael tightened his grip on the flashlight. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice low, trying to sound as non-threatening as possible. "I just want to help." The retriever let out a low whine and moved toward the back room. Michael followed. As he stepped past the doorway, his flashlight landed on a shape in the corner. His breath caught. A child. A boy, no older than 7 or 8, huddled against the wall, his arms wrapped protectively around something small. His face was dirty, his blonde hair matted, and his wide, terrified eyes locked onto Michael. Michael's gaze shifted downward. In the boy's arms, swaddled in a thin, dirty blanket, was a tiny baby. Michael's stomach dropped. The infant barely moved, her tiny chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Her cheeks were hollow, her skin pale, and she didn't cry, which was more alarming than if she had. The boy held her tightly, his small body curled around hers like a shield. Michael crouched slowly, keeping his hands visible, his voice calm but urgent. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. "My name's Michael. I'm a firefighter. I promise I'm here to help." The boy pressed himself further into the corner, his grip on the baby tightening. No, his voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Why, you're gonna take her? Michael's chest tightened. Take her, he repeated carefully. I'm not taking anyone anywhere. But your sister, he nodded toward the baby. She looks like she needs help. And so do you. How long have you been here? The boy clenched his jaw, his eyes darting between Michael and the door. Then, the retriever moved forward, pressing her nose against the boy's arm. Michael watched closely. The boy's face twisted, a mixture of relief and heartbreak. His lips trembled as he buried his face in the dog's fur. I thought you left. His voice cracked. The dog whined and licked his cheek. Michael exhaled slowly. She didn't leave you, he said gently. She brought me here to find you. The boy looked back up, his eyes still filled with fear, but now mixed with something else. Hope. Michael took another step forward. What's your name? The boy hesitated before answering, his voice barely audible. Jake. Michael nodded. Okay, Jake. And your sister? Jake's arms tightened around the baby. Emma. Michael swallowed hard. Jake and Emma. A 7-year-old and a baby. Alone, starving, terrified. Jake, Michael said. How long have you been here? The boy's small fingers gripped the blanket tighter. A long time. Michael's jaw clenched. He glanced around the broken-down cabin, the empty cans, the note he had found outside. Where are your parents? Jake's eyes flickered with anger and something else, betrayal. They left. Michael's stomach twisted. Left. He tried to keep his voice steady. How long ago? Jake's bottom lip quivered. I don't know. He looked away, his arms still wrapped around Emma. A while. They said they'd come back. But Michael took a slow breath. But they didn't. The weight of that truth sat heavy in the air. Michael scanned Emma again, her tiny, unmoving body. The way Jake held her so tightly, like he was the only thing keeping her alive. Michael knew time was running out. Jake, he said, his voice gentle but firm. Emma needs a doctor. She's really sick. Jake shook his head furiously. No hospitals. They'll take us away. Michael's chest ached at the sheer terror in the boy's voice. I promise you, he said, no one is going to take you anywhere without me. But Emma, she needs help. And so do you. Jake's breath hitched. Michael reached out, slowly, careful not to startle him. I know you don't trust me yet, he said. But I swear to you, Jake, I'm not leaving without you too. The room fell silent. Then, Jake's fingers loosened slightly around Emma's blanket. He looked at Michael, his eyes brimming with exhaustion and fear. And after a long, painful moment, he nodded. Michael released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Okay, he murmured. Let's get out of here. He reached forward carefully, lifting Emma's frail little body into his arms. She barely stirred. Jake stood slowly, his legs weak, his hands never leaving the golden retriever's fur. Michael turned toward the door. Come on, kid, he said. We're going home. And with that, they stepped out of the darkness. Michael stepped out of the dilapidated cabin, the cool Seattle air hitting him like a wave. His arms tightened instinctively around Emma, the tiny baby still barely stirring against his chest. Too cold, too weak, too quiet. Behind him, Jake followed hesitantly, his small hands gripping onto the golden retriever's fur like she was the only stable thing left in his world. His eyes darted around in the growing darkness, his body tense, as if expecting someone to jump out and snatch him away. Michael felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. This wasn't over. Not even close. He needed to get them out of here. Now, turning to Jake, he spoke gently. Do you have anything else inside? Anything important? Jake shook his head. Just Emma's blanket. Michael nodded and shifted Emma slightly in his arms, making sure she was secure. Then, without wasting another second, he led them toward his truck, parked just a few minutes away at the park's entrance. But as they reached the edge of the clearing, something caught Michael's eye. The torn backpack he had found earlier still lay where he had left it. And inside it, that note. He hesitated, then crouched down, pulling the crumpled paper out of his pocket. The flashlight from his phone illuminated the desperate, messy handwriting. Help US. We're still here. Please. Michael exhaled sharply. The note had been left on purpose. Someone had written this and left it near the cabin, hoping someone would find it. But who? His eyes flicked toward Jake. Did you write this? He asked carefully, holding up the note. Jake's eyes widened for a brief second before his expression shut down. His lips pressed into a thin line. Michael knew that look. Fear. Jake swallowed, shifting nervously on his feet. I just wanted someone to come. Michael's chest tightened. How long ago did you write it? Jake hesitated. A couple days. Michael's mind raced. If the note had been there for days, that meant the kids had been completely alone. Asterisk asterisk no food, no help, nothing, for at least that long. His grip on the note tightened. You said your parents left. Michael pressed, keeping his voice steady. Did they leave you this note? Or tell you to write it? Jake's fingers curled around the retriever's fur, and for a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, barely above a whisper, he muttered, Mom wrote it. But she was scared. Michael stilled. His heartbeat thumped louder in his ears. Scared of what? Jake looked away, kicking at the dirt. She said she had to go, or they'd find us. Michael's blood ran cold. They. Not just someone. Not just a person. Jake had said they. Michael crouched down to his level, keeping Emma steady in his arms. Jake, he said carefully, who was your mom scared of? The boy's lips trembled. He glanced toward the trees, then at the cabin, as if making sure no one was listening. Finally, he whispered, the bad men. Michael's jaw tightened. The bad men. Every instinct inside him screamed this wasn't just abandonment. This was something worse. Did they come to the cabin? Michael pressed, his voice calm but firm. Jake gave the faintest nod. A few times. But Mom told me to hide with Emma, and the dog barked a lot, so they didn't come in. Michael felt a chill run down his spine. Do you know why they were looking for her? Jake shook his head. She never told me. Michael's mind spun with possibilities. Drugs? An abusive ex? Something worse? Whatever it was, it had left a terrified woman and two helpless kids stranded in the woods with nothing but a loyal dog to protect them. Michael's grip on the note tightened. All right, kid, he said, rising to his feet. We need to go. Jake's eyes darted back to the cabin. What if Mom comes back? Michael's stomach twisted. He didn't know how to answer that. Did he lie? Give the kid hope? Or tell him the truth? That no mother leaves her children like this unless she's not coming back? But before he could say anything, Emma stirred against his chest. A tiny, weak sound. Michael's breath caught. He looked down. Emma's lips parted slightly, her breathing ragged and shallow. His heart lurched. Shit. She wasn't just cold. She was getting worse. Jake, listen to me, Michael said, his voice sharper now. Your sister needs help. Now. Jake's eyes filled with panic. But, no buts, Jake. Michael turned, striding quickly toward his truck, his urgency now overriding everything else. We don't have time. Jake hurried after him, his small feet scrambling to keep up. The retriever trotted beside him, her eyes never leaving the baby in Michael's arms. As they reached the truck, Michael pulled open the door and carefully settled Emma into the passenger seat, wrapping his jacket around her tiny body. He turned to Jake. Get in. Jake hesitated, staring up at Michael. Then, without another word, he climbed into the back seat, pulling the retriever up with him. Michael shut the door, pulled out his phone, and dialed 911. This is Michael Carter, he said, his voice tight. I have 2 abandoned children. One is an infant in distress. We're en route to Seattle General now. I need medical personnel waiting when we arrive. Copy that, the dispatcher replied. Seattle General has been notified. Drive safe. Michael threw the truck into drive, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tight enough to turn his knuckles white. As he pulled onto the highway, his mind raced. This was more than a rescue. This was a mystery. A woman on the run. A cryptic note. The bad men looking for them. And now, 2 abandoned kids and a loyal dog, caught in the middle of something far bigger than he had expected. Michael glanced at Jake in the rearview mirror. The boy stared out the window, his small fingers clutching the retriever's fur. His face was blank, but his eyes were filled with secrets. Michael exhaled. Whatever this was, he had a feeling it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The road to Seattle General Hospital was a blur of headlights, rain-slicked pavement, and Michael's pounding heart. Emma lay wrapped in his firefighter-issued jacket, her tiny frame barely moving. The only sign that she was still clinging to life was the weak rise and fall of her chest beneath the thick fabric. Michael's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He had seen a lot of things in his years as a firefighter: burn victims, car accidents, overdoses. But nothing compared to the sight of a starving, freezing baby barely hanging on in his passenger seat. In the back seat, Jake sat stiffly, his arms wrapped around the golden retriever, who rested her head in his lap. He hadn't spoken since they left the park, his small face barely visible in the dim glow of the streetlights flashing through the windows. Michael stole a glance at him in the rearview mirror. "Jake," he said, keeping his voice calm despite the storm raging inside him. "We're almost there. Emma's gonna be okay." Jake didn't respond. Michael exhaled through his nose. He recognized that silence. The kind that didn't come from shyness or exhaustion, but from fear. He took a slow breath and tried again. "I know you're scared," he said. "But I promise, no one is going to hurt you. I won't let them." This time, Jake's small fingers curled tighter into the retriever's fur. "Doctors take kids away," he muttered, barely above a whisper. "They'll take Emma." Michael's chest tightened. "Is that what someone told you?" Jake didn't answer. Michael clenched his jaw. He needed to choose his words carefully. If he pushed too hard, Jake might shut down completely. So instead, he took another approach. "Jake, listen," he said, his voice firm but steady. "I've been a firefighter for a long time. I know the doctors at this hospital. They don't take kids away. They help them." Jake's eyes flickered to the baby in Michael's arms. Michael pressed on. "And Emma needs help right now. She's sick. And I know you've been taking care of her. But this is too big for you to do alone. Let's get her checked out, make sure she's okay. After that, we'll figure everything else out. Together." Silence. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Jake gave a small, reluctant nod. Michael exhaled, relief washing over him. They pulled into the emergency entrance of Seattle General, the red emergency sign glowing in the rain-slicked night. Before he even had the truck in park, the hospital doors burst open, a team of nurses and paramedics rushing toward them. Michael didn't hesitate. He threw open the door, lifted Emma into his arms, and carried her toward the nearest nurse. "Infant, approximately 4 to 6 months old," he said quickly. "Severe dehydration, malnourished, unresponsive for the past 10 minutes. The nurse, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and graying blonde hair, took one look at Emma and immediately called for a trauma room. "Get her inside," she barked at the nearest doctor. Michael hesitated only for a second before passing Emma into the doctor's careful hands. A cold emptiness settled in his chest the moment he let go of her. He had barely known this child for an hour, and yet, the idea of losing her made his stomach turn. "Sir, are you a relative?" the nurse asked. Michael shook his head, pulling himself back into focus. "No," he admitted. "But she was abandoned. I found her and her brother." He turned, looking toward his truck. Jake still sat rigid in the back seat, his fingers digging into the retriever's fur like a lifeline. His eyes darted between Michael and the hospital entrance, terror painted across his small face. Michael moved fast. He opened the back door and crouched down, his voice calm but firm. "Jake, I need you to come with me. Emma's in good hands, and I'm not going to let anything bad happen to you." Jake hesitated. Then, he whispered, "Are they going to ask questions?" Michael frowned. That question didn't sit right. "Yeah," he admitted. "They'll probably ask about your mom and what happened. But you don't have to talk if you don't want to." Jake's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't move. Michael felt the seconds ticking away. Finally, he took a risk. "I need you to trust me, buddy," he said. "Just for tonight. We'll figure out everything else tomorrow. I promise." Jake's hands tightened on the dog's fur. Then, slowly, so slowly, he nodded. Michael reached out, giving him space to come on his own. And after a long pause, Jake slid out of the truck, the retriever never leaving his side. Michael straightened, keeping a protective hand on Jake's shoulder as he led him into the hospital. Inside, the bright lights and sterile smell hit them immediately. A young female nurse approached with a warm smile, but Jake shrank back. Michael immediately stepped between them. "I got this," he told her softly. She hesitated, then nodded and stepped away. Michael crouched back down to Jake's level. "Listen," he said, his voice low. "Let's just sit in the waiting room for now, okay? No one is going to take you anywhere. We'll stay together." Jake's eyes searched his. Then, for the first time since they had met, Jake reached out, just slightly, toward Michael's jacket. Michael stilled, barely daring to breathe. Then, carefully, he reached back. And in that quiet moment, Jake let him take his hand. Michael squeezed it gently, then stood. "Come on, kid," he murmured. "Let's go check on your sister." And together, they walked down the hall. This wasn't over. Jake was hiding something. And whatever it was, whoever it was still out there. Watching. waiting. And Michael was going to make damn sure no one got their hands on these kids ever again. The emergency room was alive with movement. Nurses rushed from station to station, doctors called out orders, and monitors beeped in a steady, rhythmic pulse. The scent of antiseptic and sterilized air clung to everything, mixing with the faint aroma of stale coffee from the nurse's station. But for Michael, the only thing that mattered was Emma. Through the large glass window of the trauma bay, he could see the tiny infant lying on a hospital bed, IVs taped to her fragile arms, her body wrapped in warming blankets. A doctor hovered over her, checking vitals, while a nurse adjusted the machines monitoring her heart rate. Michael clenched his fists. She was still too quiet, too still. Beside him, Jake sat motionless in a plastic chair, the retriever curled up at his feet. The boy's small hands dug into the dog's fur, his eyes locked on his sister through the glass. Michael could feel the tension radiating off of him. "You doing okay, buddy?" he asked quietly. Jake didn't answer at first. He just sat there, his thin shoulders hunched, his fingers absently stroking the dog's head. Then, finally, "They're going to take her away, aren't they?" Michael's heart twisted. "They're going to put us in one of those places. Like the others." Michael crouched down, keeping his voice calm but firm. "What others?" Jake blinked, as if realizing he had said too much. He shook his head quickly. "Nothing. Doesn't matter." Michael sighed. It did matter. The kid was terrified of something. And Michael had a feeling it wasn't just about being taken into foster care. Something had happened before. Before he could push further, a nurse in blue scrubs approached. "Mr. Carter?" Michael rose to his feet. "How's Emma?" "Stable for now," the nurse said. "She's severely malnourished, dehydrated, and has an infection that could have turned into pneumonia if she hadn't been brought in when she was. But she's a fighter." Michael exhaled. Relief, mixed with something deeper. Anger. She was a fighter, but she shouldn't have had to be. "Can I see her?" The nurse hesitated. "Not yet. She needs more fluids, and the doctor wants to monitor her oxygen levels for a while longer." Michael nodded, glancing down at Jake. "Can he see her?" The nurse softened. "A few minutes, but only if he stays calm. We don't want to stress her." Jake was already standing before she even finished speaking. Michael rested a hand on his shoulder. "Remember, buddy, be gentle." Jake didn't even look at him. His eyes were locked on Emma as the nurse led him toward the bed. Michael followed a few steps behind, watching as the boy hesitated at the bedside, his hands curling into fists. Then, slowly, he reached out, his fingers barely brushing against the baby's blanket. Michael swallowed hard. Whatever had happened to these kids, it had left scars, and not the kind that healed easily. Michael stepped out into the hallway, needing a moment to think. He ran a hand down his face, exhaustion creeping in. He still had no idea where their mother was, who these bad men were, or what the hell had led to two kids being left alone in the woods. He needed answers. And right now, his best bet was Jake. But before he could head back inside, his phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, expecting it to be the police or a caseworker. But the caller ID made his stomach drop. Unknown number. A cold prickle ran up his spine. He hesitated, then answered. "Hello." Silence. Static crackled faintly on the other end. Then, a click, and the line went dead. Michael lowered the phone slowly, his gut tightening. Coincidence? Or something else? His jaw clenched. He needed to talk to the police. Now, as he turned, his eyes caught movement near the waiting room entrance. A man, tall, slender, hood pulled low over his face. He was standing near the check-in desk, his back partially turned, but something about him. The way he stood too still, the way his head barely tilted as if listening in on the conversations around him, felt wrong. Michael's instincts flared. This wasn't just a guy waiting for someone. This was someone watching. His pulse kicked up as he took a slow step forward, his firefighter instincts screaming at him. And then, the man turned sharply and walked out the doors. Michael didn't think, he reacted. He shoved his phone into his pocket and followed. The night air was damp with Seattle drizzle as Michael stepped outside. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for a few scattered cars beneath the glow of flickering streetlights. But the man was already halfway across the lot, moving fast. Michael took off after him. "Hey," he called. "Stop." The man didn't slow. Michael picked up the pace, his boots slamming against the pavement. The guy wasn't running yet, but he was moving like someone who didn't want to be caught. Michael gained on him fast. "Hey, I said stop." This time, The man whipped his head around. Michael barely caught a glimpse. Dark eyes, sharp features, a thin scar along his jaw, before the guy spun back and broke into a full sprint. Michael swore and bolted after him. The man darted between cars, weaving through the lot, his breath ragged in the damp air. Michael pushed harder, closing the distance. His firefighter training had conditioned him for this, chasing down panicked civilians, carrying people through burning buildings. But just as he was about to grab the guy's arm, the man suddenly pivoted hard, ducking around the side of a black SUV, and disappeared. Michael skidded to a stop. The space behind the SUV was empty. No sign of movement. No footsteps. Nothing. Michael's chest heaved. He whipped his head around, searching the lot, his muscles coiled, waiting for an attack. But the man was gone. Vanished. Like he had never been there in the first place. Michael exhaled sharply. Something was very, very wrong. Slowly, he pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed. A moment later, a voice answered. Seattle PD. Michael gritted his teeth. This is Michael Carter. I need to file a report. A pause. What's the nature of the report? Michael's jaw tightened. A possible threat against 2 children. This wasn't just a possibility. It was a certainty. And whoever that man was, whoever had been watching, they weren't done. Not yet. Michael paced the hospital waiting room, his mind racing. Who the hell was that guy? He had spent years in the fire department pulling people out of disasters. But this was different. Fires didn't stalk people. Fires didn't disappear into the night like ghosts. He needed answers. Now, taking a steadying breath, he glanced toward the pediatric unit where Jake sat in a chair beside Emma's hospital crib. The boy had barely spoken since they arrived, his fingers still tangled in the retriever's fur as if she were the only thing tethering him to reality. Michael clenched his fists. He couldn't push Jake too hard. Not yet. But he had to get something. He crossed the room and pulled up a chair beside the boy. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Michael leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. Jake, he said quietly, I need you to tell me the truth. Jake didn't look at him. Michael swallowed, keeping his voice gentle but firm. I know you're scared, and I know you think talking about this will make things worse. But I just chased a man out of this hospital, someone who was watching us. Watching you. Jake stiffened, his small hands gripping the retriever tighter. Michael pressed on. Your mom didn't just leave, did she? Silence. Michael exhaled through his nose. You said she was scared of the bad men. Are they the ones who were after her? Jake's fingers dug into the dog's fur so hard that the retriever let out a small, pained whimper. Michael immediately softened his tone. Hey, you're safe here. I promise. Jake's breathing hitched. Michael waited. Let the silence stretch. Then, finally, Jake whispered 3 words that sent a chill down Michael's spine. They took Dad. Michael stilled. His heartbeat slowed, his mind racing. What do you mean? He asked carefully. Jake's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. They took him, he repeated, his voice barely audible. A few months ago, Mom told me not to talk about it. She said if we kept quiet, they'd leave us alone. Michael's stomach twisted. Who? He asked. Jake shook his head. I don't know. Mom just called them the men. She was scared all the time. She told me never to open the door unless it was her. Michael's pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't just abandonment. This was something bigger. Jake, he said carefully. Was your dad in trouble? Jake hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. Michael exhaled sharply. This was starting to make sense. The mother didn't run. She was hiding. And now she was gone. Michael leaned back, running a hand down his face. Okay, he said. We're gonna figure this out, buddy. But I need you to trust me. I need you to tell me anything you remember, anything about these men, or what your mom said before she left. Jake hesitated. Then, finally, he lifted his head. There was a man, he murmured. He came to the cabin once. He knocked on the door, but Mom wouldn't let him in. She told him to go away. But he said she had nowhere left to run. Michael's blood ran cold. Jake's small hands clenched into fists. He said we were already dead, that it was just a matter of time. Michael's jaw tightened. Who the hell were these people? His eyes flicked toward Emma, her tiny chest rising and falling with every breath. If these men had taken their father, were they coming for the kids next? A sick feeling twisted in Michael's gut. He had to get the police involved. Now, Michael stepped out into the hallway and pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for only a second before he dialed. A few rings later, A familiar voice answered. Seattle PD, this is Detective Thomas. Michael exhaled. Detective, it's Carter. I've got a situation. That firefighter Carter? The detective asked, sounding mildly amused. You know, people usually call 911 first. Michael wasn't in the mood. This is serious, Thomas. I've got 2 abandoned kids here, one of them in the ICU. Their father's missing. Their mother's vanished. And someone just followed us to the hospital. The detective's tone shifted instantly. Where are you? Seattle General. Pediatric wing. Give me 10 minutes. The line went dead. Michael shoved his phone back into his pocket, his mind still racing. Whatever was going on here, he had just stepped into something far bigger than he expected. And now, it was his problem too. Michael had barely returned to Jake's side when a nurse entered the room. Sir, she said, hesitating at the door. There's a call for you at the front desk. A woman asking for you by name. Michael's entire body went rigid. A woman asking for him. His gut twisted. What's her name? He asked. The nurse frowned. She didn't say, just that it was urgent. Michael's eyes flicked to Jake. The boy's face had gone pale. Michael stood slowly. I'll take it in the hallway. The nurse nodded and stepped aside. Michael moved toward the waiting area, his muscles tensed, his instincts screaming that something wasn't right. He reached the front desk and grabbed the phone. This is Carter, he said. Silence. Then, a voice, barely above a whisper. You need to let them go. Michael's pulse spiked. Who is this? They're watching. If you don't walk away, they'll kill you too. Michael's fingers tightened around the phone. A click. The line went dead. Michael's grip on the receiver didn't loosen. His mind reeled. The woman. Could it be the kid's mother? Or was it someone else? A warning? A threat? He inhaled sharply, his fists clenching. Whoever was after these kids. They weren't done. And neither was he. He wasn't walking away. He was going to fight. And whoever these people were, they were about to find out exactly what happened when a firefighter refused to back down. Michael stood in the dimly lit hospital hallway, his grip on the phone tightening as the weight of the warning settled in his chest. You need to let them go. They're watching. If you don't walk away, they'll kill you too. His breathing slowed, controlled, measured. Whoever had called him wasn't just trying to scare him. They were serious. And that only meant one thing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Michael turned, scanning the hospital entrance through the wide glass doors. Rain pattered against the sidewalk outside, turning the street into a shimmering mess of red and white reflections from passing cars. Then he saw him, Detective David Thomas. A tall, gruff-looking man in his early 40s, dressed in a dark Seattle PD jacket. His face was lined with exhaustion, and his short-cropped hair was peppered with gray. But his eyes, sharp, calculating, immediately locked onto Michael the moment he stepped inside. Michael took a deep breath and met him halfway. Carter, Thomas greeted, shaking off the rain as he pushed open the hospital doors. You don't usually call me unless something's on fire. Michael didn't bother with small talk. 2 abandoned kids, he said, voice tight. The father's missing. The mother's gone. And someone just called me, warning me to walk away. Thomas's easy smirk disappeared. You serious? Michael pulled his phone out, showing the recent blocked call. Someone's watching us, detective, he said. And they don't want me involved. Thomas swore under his breath. All right, he muttered. Start from the beginning. Michael didn't waste time. He told him everything. How he had found the golden retriever and her puppy in the park. How they had led him to the cabin. How he had discovered Jake and Emma, alone and starving. How Jake had mentioned the bad men and his father being taken. And now, the mysterious man in the hospital. The phone call. The whispered warning. When Michael finished, Thomas's expression was unreadable. Jesus, he muttered, running a hand through his damp hair. This isn't just an abandonment case. This is something else. Michael folded his arms. You think? Thomas's gaze darkened. If the father was taken, hell, if the mom ran, it means there's a damn good reason. And if these people are watching you. He exhaled sharply. Then yeah, we've got a problem. Michael's jaw tightened. I'm not letting these kids go into the system without knowing who the hell is after them, he said. Emma almost died out there, Thomas. And Jake, he's scared. More than scared. He's waiting for the moment these people come back for him. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. All right, I'll start digging. But Carter, he pinned him with a serious look. You keep your head down. You're a firefighter, not a cop. Michael didn't flinch. Yeah. He crossed his arms. Well, right now, I'm the only damn thing standing between those kids and whatever's coming for them. Thomas sighed. Yeah, and that's what worries me. After Thomas left to run the initial search on Jake and Emma's missing parents, Michael returned to the hospital room. Jake was asleep in the chair, his small body curled up against the retriever's warm fur. The dog hadn't moved once, her watchful eyes flicking up when Michael entered. Emma was still in the crib, her tiny chest rising and falling beneath the blankets. She looked stronger than before, but still too small, too fragile. Michael let out a quiet breath and sat in the chair beside Jake, rubbing a hand over his face. For the first time in hours, the weight of exhaustion crashed into him. Everything was happening too fast. He had walked into that park just looking to clear his mind. Now, he was wrapped up in something dangerous, something that involved missing people, threats, and children caught in the middle. Michael glanced at Jake, his thin face peaceful in sleep. And he knew. He wasn't walking away from this. It was close to 2 a.m. when something woke him. A sound. Soft. Distant. At first, he thought it was just the hospital noise. Nurses walking, machines beeping. But then, a shift of movement outside the room. Michael's eyes snapped open. The retriever lifted her head, ears alert. Something was off. Michael stood, stepping toward the door. His instincts screamed danger as he glanced through the small window into the hallway. At first, nothing. Just a quiet hospital wing. Then, a shadow moved near the nurse's station. Michael's muscles tensed. The figure was wearing a hood, a dark jacket, and they weren't moving like a visitor. They were moving like someone who didn't want to be seen. Michael's pulse pounded. Whoever this was, they weren't here by accident. And they were too damn close to the kids. His stomach coiled with adrenaline. He didn't wait. Michael pushed open the door and stepped into the hallway. The man must have sensed him, because he turned sharply, his face hidden beneath the hood. For a second, they just stared at each other. Then, the man moved. Fast. Too fast. Michael lunged forward, grabbing for him. But the guy was quicker. He shoved past Michael, darting down the hallway. Michael cursed and took off after him. Footsteps pounded against the tile floor as they raced toward the exit. Michael was gaining. But then, the guy suddenly veered left, shoving through the emergency stairwell door. Michael burst through after him, the stairwell echoing with the sound of their footsteps. The man took the steps 2 at a time, his hand grazing the railing as he spiraled down. Michael was right on his heels, heart pounding, blood roaring in his ears. He reached for him, but just as his fingers brushed the man's jacket, the guy spun. A fist came flying toward Michael's face. Michael barely dodged, his instincts kicking in as he threw up his arm. The impact sent pain radiating through his forearm, but it didn't stop him. He shoved forward, slamming the man against the stairwell wall. "Who the hell are you?" Michael growled, his forearm pinning the guy's chest. The man gritted his teeth, but said nothing. Michael's breath came fast. "You've got 5 seconds before I..." Then, the guy moved. A knee drove hard into Michael's gut, knocking the air from his lungs. He stumbled back just enough, and in that split second, the man slipped free. Michael tried to grab him again, but too late. The guy shoved open the stairwell door, vanishing into the night. Michael cursed, slamming his fist against the railing. Damn it! His heart pounded as he stood there, breathing hard. Who was he? And more importantly, had he just been scouting the hospital? Or was he coming back for the kids? Michael's jaw set in stone. One thing was clear. This wasn't just a threat anymore. It was a hunt. Michael stood at the base of the hospital stairwell, his chest rising and falling in heavy breaths, his muscles still tense from the chase. The man was gone, but his presence lingered, like a shadow stretching through the empty corridors. Michael knew what this was now. They weren't just watching. They were waiting. Michael forced himself to shake off the frustration, turning and heading back toward the pediatric wing. Every step he took was measured, controlled. His instincts, honed from years of pulling people from burning buildings, told him one thing: get to the kids. Protect them first. Figure out the rest later. When he reached Emma's hospital room, he stopped just outside the door. Through the small glass window, he could see Jake still curled up in the chair, his hand gripping the retriever's fur. The dog's eyes flicked toward the door as if sensing Michael's presence. Jake was still asleep. Michael hesitated, pressing his lips into a tight line. How much had this kid already been through? He ran a hand through his hair, then quietly pushed the door open and stepped inside. The soft hum of hospital machines filled the silence. Emma was still stable. Her tiny chest rose and fell beneath the blankets, the four in her arm feeding her the nutrients she had been denied for too long. Michael exhaled slowly. At least she was safe, for now. He had barely sat down when Jake suddenly jerked awake. A sharp, gasping breath, his small body going rigid. His head snapped up, his wide blue eyes darting around in panic. Michael was at his side in an instant. "Jake," he said, keeping his voice calm but firm. "Hey, you're okay. You're safe." Jake's chest rose and fell rapidly, his breath shallow and erratic. Michael could see it now. The kid wasn't fully awake. He was caught somewhere between the nightmare and reality. Michael didn't touch him, but he leaned forward slightly, keeping his voice steady. "Hey, buddy. It's me. Michael. You're in the hospital, remember?" Jake blinked rapidly, his small hands trembling. Michael waited. And finally, after a long, tense pause, Jake's eyes focused. His breath hitched. He looked around, realizing where he was. His gaze dropped to the retriever, who let out a small, reassuring whine, pressing her head against his arm. Jake swallowed hard. "I saw them," he whispered. Michael's stomach tightened. He crouched down so they were eye level. "Who, Jake?" The boy's small hands curled into fists. "The men," he whispered. "They were standing outside the cabin, just waiting. They never knocked. They just stood there, watching." Michael's jaw clenched. Jake looked up, his eyes filled with something that made Michael's chest ache. Resignation. "They're not going to stop, are they?" Jake asked quietly. Michael exhaled sharply. He didn't lie. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know one thing, kid." Jake blinked at him. "They're not getting to you," Michael said firmly. "Not while I'm around." Jake studied him, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. Michael patted his shoulder gently and stood up. "Try to get some rest, okay?" Jake hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "Are you leaving?" Michael stilled. His chest tightened. How many times had this kid been left behind? Michael shook his head. "No, buddy. I'm staying right here." Michael didn't sleep. He sat in the hospital chair for hours, his mind replaying the night's events like a movie on repeat. The hooded man, the chase, the phone call. Whoever these people were, they were serious. And Michael had no intention of waiting around for them to make their next move. By the time Detective Thomas arrived the next morning, Michael was already up, drinking the worst hospital coffee he had ever tasted. Thomas looked as exhausted as Michael felt. "Tell me you found something," Michael muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. Thomas pulled out a file and tossed it onto the small hospital table. Michael frowned and flipped it open. The first thing he saw was a mugshot. A man in his mid-40s. Sharp features. Cold eyes. A thin scar along his jaw. Michael's pulse spiked. It was the guy from the hospital. "Who is he?" Michael asked, his voice tight. Thomas exhaled. "Name's Victor Rains," he said. "Career criminal. Extortion, weapons trafficking, drug distribution. He's got ties to some pretty nasty people." Michael's stomach turned. Why the hell would someone like that be after a single mother and her kids? Thomas's jaw tightened. "That's the part we're still figuring out," he admitted. "But it gets worse." Michael looked up. Thomas leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "Victor Rains wasn't just watching you last night," he said. "He was arrested 3 years ago. Did a short stint for illegal arms sales." Michael frowned. "And?" Thomas's expression darkened. "He was cellmates with a guy named Daniel Foster." Michael froze. "Foster," he echoed. Thomas nodded. "Jake and Emma's father." Michael sat back, his mind spinning. Jake had told him his dad had been taken. But what if it wasn't just a random disappearance? What if his father was involved with these people? What was Foster in for? Michael asked. Thomas flipped through the file. White-collar stuff. Money laundering, fraud, nothing violent. But he got tangled up with the wrong crowd. And when he got out of prison, he disappeared. Michael's pulse pounded. He suddenly thought back to what Jake had said. "Mom told me if we stayed quiet, they'd leave us alone." Michael's jaw clenched. This wasn't about just finding them. This was about debt. Whatever Daniel Foster had done, he owed these people something. And now, they were coming to collect. Michael's fists curled. "Over my dead body." Michael closed the file, looking up at Thomas. "What do we do?" Thomas's expression was grim. "We move them," he said. "Protective custody. We get them out of here before these guys make their next move." Michael exhaled, glancing toward the hospital room. Jake and Emma didn't have anyone else. And now, he was their only shot. Finally, he nodded. All right, he said, but I'm coming with them. Thomas arched a brow. You sure about that, Carter? Michael's gaze hardened. Damn right I am. He looked back at the hospital door. Those kids aren't going through this alone. And Michael Carter wasn't backing down. The decision was made. Michael wasn't walking away. Not when Jake and Emma had no one else. Not when the men who had taken their father were now coming for them. He didn't know exactly what Daniel Foster had done, but it didn't matter. The kids weren't paying for his mistakes. Michael wouldn't let them. Detective Thomas ran a hand over his face, sighing. All right, Carter. If you're in, you're in. But you need to understand, these guys don't just give up. If they think those kids are still valuable to them, they will keep coming. Michael already knew that. We'll put them in protective custody, Thomas continued. Transport them out of Seattle, keep them safe while we figure out what the hell Raines and his people actually want. Michael nodded. How soon can we move? Tomorrow morning. Michael frowned. That's too long. Thomas held up a hand. I get it, but I need time to set this up. We can't just throw them in the back of a police car and drive. We need an unmarked transport, a secure location, and a plan that doesn't scream, we're running. Otherwise, we'll be leading these guys straight to them. Michael gritted his teeth. A whole night in the hospital. Waiting. He hated it, but Thomas was right. If they moved too soon, they could be walking into a trap. Michael exhaled sharply. Fine, but I'm staying here tonight. No cops at the door. No guards. Just me. Thomas's brow furrowed. You sure? Michael's jaw tightened. They're coming, Thomas. We both know it. And if they do, I want to be the one waiting for them. Thomas studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right, Carter. Your fight. Michael returned to Emma's hospital room, his senses on high alert. Everything felt too quiet. Jake was still curled up in the chair, wide awake now, staring at the ceiling. The retriever was at his feet, her ears perked up, as if she, too, was sensing something was wrong. Michael sat across from him. How's she doing? He asked, nodding toward Emma's crib. Jake swallowed, his voice small. The nurse said she's getting better. Michael exhaled. At least there was that. Jake's small hands gripped the armrests. Are we leaving? Tomorrow morning, Michael confirmed. But until then, we're staying put. Jake's fingers twitched. They're gonna come, aren't they? Michael didn't lie. Yeah, buddy. Maybe. Jake slowly turned his gaze toward Michael. Will you stop them? Michael didn't hesitate. Yes. Something in Jake's expression shifted. For the first time, trust flickered in his eyes. Michael leaned back in the chair. Try to get some sleep, he said. I'll be right here the whole time. Jake hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. But Michael? Michael didn't sleep. The clock on the hospital wall read 3:17 a.m. when Michael heard it. A soft click. A door down the hall. Michael's eyes snapped open, every muscle in his body going rigid. They were here. He stood slowly, moving toward the door, keeping his footsteps silent. Another sound, the creak of a floorboard. Michael's jaw set. He reached for the scalpel he had grabbed earlier from the medical cart, the only weapon he had, and pressed his back against the wall beside the door. He waited. The retriever let out a low, warning growl. And then, the door burst open. A man in black lunged inside, his eyes wild, a gun raised. Michael moved first. A hard, brutal strike to the arm, knocking the gun sideways. The shot fired, the bullet lodging into the ceiling. Michael slammed the scalpel deep into the man's forearm. A sharp scream, blood splattering against the floor. Michael grabbed his collar, driving him back into the wall. Where are the others? He growled. The man struggled, his teeth clenched. Too late, he hissed. Michael's stomach dropped. Emma. He turned just in time to see a second man, already reaching for her. Michael reacted on instinct. He lunged, grabbing a metal four-pole and swinging hard. A sickening crack. The second man collapsed, unconscious. The first man shoved off the wall, but before he could grab his weapon again, the retriever lunged. She snapped her teeth around his wrist, dragging him down. Michael wasted no time. A hard punch to the jaw. Another. The man's head slammed into the floor. Out cold. Michael's chest heaved. His pulse pounded. He turned to Jake, who was standing frozen, his wide eyes locked on the two unmoving men. Michael knelt in front of him. Jake, he said, look at me. The boy's breath was shaky, but he met Michael's gaze. Are you hurt? Jake shook his head. Michael gripped his shoulder firmly. You did good, buddy. I need you to stay right here. Can you do that for me? Jake nodded quickly. Michael stood, pulled out his phone, and dialed. Thomas answered immediately. They came. Michael said, his voice sharp. I have 2 down, but I don't know if there are more. On our way, Thomas said. Michael hung up. His jaw tightened. He turned toward the hospital door. If anyone else was coming, they weren't getting through him. Michael stood at the entrance of the hospital room, his body a wall between Jake, Emma, and whatever was coming. He could feel it in his bones. More were coming. He gripped the scalpel tighter in his fist. The retriever sat beside him, her ears alert. Jake was behind them, eyes locked on the door. Michael glanced back at him. You scared? Jake hesitated. Then, slowly, he shook his head. Michael's chest swelled. He faced forward again, his heart pounding as the heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. A dark shadow moved just outside the glass window. Then, a gun clicked. Michael took a breath. This was it. The fight wasn't over. But neither was he. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. If you watched until this point, comment, I watched until here, and share your thoughts on this story. Oh, and don't forget to check out the next video on the end screen. It's really exciting.